Hi, this is Anton from the Terra team. In this video, you're going to learn how to create a dataset in the Terra Data Repository and how to set up the schema for that dataset. Instructions for this tutorial are summarized in 2 articles in our support documentation. The steps for executing the API to create a dataset are summarized in the article titled Creating a Dataset. Details on how to set up the schema for a dataset are summarized in the article called Setting Schema for a Dataset. A dataset in the Terra Data Repository is built with a sort of template called a schema that determines what sort of data categories may be included in the dataset. Think of the schema as a sort of map that outlines what tables are contained in a dataset, what columns are contained within those tables, and what types of data are populating those columns. It's important to understand that when you first create a dataset, it is completely blank unless you've set a schema. The schema determines what kind of columns can be ingested into the dataset. Data that's ingested into a dataset doesn't have to include every type of data that's listed in the schema, but all data that's being ingested has to be represented at least somewhere in the schema. So the schema determines the scope of the dataset. It also determines whether there are any relations between the columns of the different tables within the dataset. The schema is set in the form of a JSON object that's a part of the command body used in the API endpoint used for creating the dataset. To create a dataset, find the Create Dataset API endpoint of the data repository's Swagger page. If you're properly authenticated, you should be able to activate this API by clicking Try It Out. The API request body contains several important parameters. The cloud platform, which in this tutorial we'll have set to GCP, the name, which is an arbitrary string you choose as the name of your dataset, the region parameter, which refers to the GCP storage region for the dataset, the default profile ID parameter, which is the profile ID linked to your billing profile, and the schema parameter. This parameter is a nested JSON object unto itself that lists tables, relationships between the tables, and assets which are comprised of columns contained within those datasets. Let's take a look at an example of a schema. Here's a simple example of a type of dataset we might want to set up. In this dataset, we have 2 tables. One is the participant table, and the other is the BAM file table. Each of these tables has 2 columns, and one of those columns is supposed to match, which is to say, both the participant and the BAM file tables have a column for a matching sample ID. Let's take a look at the JSON that defines these tables along with their columns, and also defines the relationship between the tables, which matches the sample ID columns in the 2 tables. When you execute the API request, the body will contain a nested JSON object describing the schema. This may make this code body seem quite long, but it's a necessary part of setting up a dataset properly. The schema JSON contains additional parameters that are themselves also nested JSON objects. These fall into 3 categories: the tables JSON, the relationships JSON, and the assets JSON. In the example in this video, we'll go over a schema that has tables and a relationship between those tables. We'll skip over creating an asset for this dataset. The assets are just the lists of columns from the tables within the dataset that can be shared. Let's take a look at the JSON object in this example. The first parameter is the tables parameter, which is its own JSON object. This JSON object contains a number of parameters. The first parameter is the name for the table. In this example, we'll start with the BAM file table, which we name like this. The columns parameter is also a nested JSON object, which can contain an array of objects to define every column within that table. In this case, we have a column named sample ID. The data type for that column is a string, And in the example in this tutorial, we'll also be setting the array_of parameter, which is a required parameter, to false. The second column in that table is named BAM file path, and the data type is FileRef. We want to set the data type to FileRef so that the Terra Data Repository knows to treat the input to this column as a path to a file in the cloud. This will make it possible to render the entries in this column as hyperlinks and also to run workflows against this data that expect file inputs rather than just strings. There are a few other parameters that need to show up, even though we'll basically be setting them to blank values. These include the primary key, partition mode, date partition options, int partition options, and row count. The second table is another nested JSON object, separated from the first one by a comma. This table is named participant, and the columns within it are named sample ID and phenotype. In this case, the data types for both columns is string. In this example, once we've written out these, we'll close out the JSON object for the tables parameter. Since we want to also define a relationship between the two tables, we'll set another JSON object on the same level as the tables JSON, again separated by a comma. In this case, we'll have just one relationship. We'll name that relationship samples, and then we need to fill out the entries for the from parameter and the to parameter. In this example, it doesn't matter which is which, so we'll just define our relationship as being from the sample ID in the participant table to the sample ID in the BAM file table. You can paste this JSON object exactly as it is into the Create a Dataset API. You can also take the schema from another existing dataset to which you have access by using the Retrieve Dataset API endpoint, which is in the Datasets section of the Data Repos Swagger API page. To retrieve a schema, enter the UUID for the dataset whose schema you're interested in, and select Schema under the Include menu. Once you hit Execute, if you've used a valid UUID, the response body will include a JSON object for the entire schema of that dataset, so you can mimic any dataset to which you already have access when creating a new dataset by copying and pasting that schema JSON into your Create Dataset API request. Once you execute the Create Dataset API, you should be able to see your dataset in the Terra Data Repository's user interface at data.terra.bio. It won't be populated with any data, but you'll at least be able to see the tables that you've created. In the following tutorials, we'll take a closer look at how to ingest data and also set up assets of data, which are lists of columns that are available for sharing. Thank you for listening.